Hi everyone. Today I'm gonna take you through the process that I use to make my naturally colored orange clove soap. I start out by measuring out my essential oils that I use. For this recipe I use orange, cinnamon leaf, clove, and nutmeg. And I like to start out measuring the essential oils for every soap that I do because it sort of sets the tone for the soap. The next additive that I'm going to prepare is the pumpkin puree that goes into this. I'm just taking it from a can and I'm going to measure out a few tablespoons. Now I'm starting to measure out our oils that we're going to be putting into the soap. First is coconut oil. Then is shea butter. And then cocoa butter. These are all of the hard oils that I'll be using in this recipe. The process that I use for making most of my soaps is sometimes called the heat transfer process. So what it means is you take your hard or solid oils and butters and you combine those directly with your lye water. And the heat from the lye water is going to melt those harder oils into liquid. I find that this process saves a lot of time because you don't need to wait for your hard oils to melt by heating them up, and you also don't need to wait for your lye water to cool. Next, I'm measuring out my liquid oils. First is my turmeric infused olive oil, which has about 2 tablespoons per 500 grams of olive oil. Next is avocado oil and then castor oil. Then I measure out my distilled water. And I combine that with my sodium hydroxide or lye that I pre-measured earlier. You always want to add your lye to your water and not your water to your lye. And make sure that you understand safety procedure for handling sodium hydroxide. You should always be wearing gloves, a chemical protective apron, eyeglasses or goggles, and a simple face mask. Now I'm going to be combining my lye water with my hard oils, and I do this through a strainer to catch any impurities that may have been collected in the water. And it will immediately start to melt the hard oils, but I give it a stir right away, and then I'll continue to stir it for about 5 or 10 minutes until it's fully incorporated, just stirring every couple of minutes or so. I popped my liquid oils that I measured out earlier into the microwave for about a minute until they reached 100 degrees. And then I waited for my lye water and solid oil mixture to reach about 100 degrees. And once they are both close to that temperature, I pour them together. And you will see now that when the turmeric infused oil finally reaches the lye water, that's when you start to see that really intense bright orange color. Once they're added together, I blend them up with an immersion blender, and I will do this for usually around 2 minutes until the batter reaches a very thin yogurt texture. Finally, I'm just adding in my additive, which is my pumpkin puree and my essential oils. You should be wearing gloves when you do this, unlike myself, because if you get any splatters from the additives, you don't want it to be touching your skin. You'll know it's ready if you lift your stick blender up and sort of dribble some batter along the top. If you're able to see a trace of that batter, then it's ready to be poured into the mold. Now I'm just scraping down the extra bits on the stick blender to make sure that I get as much as I can into the batch. This obviously makes your batch slightly larger, but it also makes cleaning your stick blender much easier. And finally, I pour into the mold. I don't do any fancy tricks here. I just pour slowly. Once it's all in the mold, I will take my spatula and just sort of gently wiggle it along the top, and this makes sure there's no little air gaps on the sides. This is especially important if your batter was quite thick when you poured. But I also like to just smooth out the top regardless of how thick it was. Okay, and I waited about 5 minutes before I started to decorate the top with the spoon. The time that you need to wait before decorating depends. Of course, it depends on the recipe that you use and the oils that you use. The harder the oils, the less time you need to wait. It also depends on which essential oils you use. Some essential oils speed things along, like cinnamon does. And it also just depends on your climate and like how warm or how humid it is where you are. And whatever pattern I do, I generally will go over it twice. I just find that it looks a lot cleaner the second time around. For this soap, I decided to decorate it with cloves, whole cloves, and I just put 1 clove per soap, but I really failed here and I measured the soap bars incorrectly. so I ended up placing them really badly, and you'll see that later when I go to cut the soap. What you should do is measure the space in between your soap cutter wires and then draw little dots that correspond with that onto your mold. And then you'll know exactly how large your bars are and where you should be placing your decorations. I waited 24 hours until I unmolded, and as you can see, in those 24 hours the color does change a lot. The top is what's going to change the most because that part was exposed to the air and it was the least insulated. I don't insulate my soaps at all, so the only insulation that they have is just from the mold that they're in. I don't keep them heated or anything like that. But once it's unmolded, you can see that a lot of that beautiful orange color is retained. Now I am just using my wire soap cutter to cut the loaf into bars. And you can see my miserable clove placement fail. The loaf that I use is a bit long, so I have to do a couple rounds of cutting before the whole loaf is chopped. So here you can see the result. It's a really interesting color. The outside is a bright, fiery orange, and the inside is more of a kind of creamy, lighter, more medium tone orange. After cutting, I went straight into beveling the soaps. This is something that you can wait to do, and I might recommend that you wait to do it at least another 24 to 48 hours until the soaps are slightly harder. You can do it after cutting your soap. You just need to keep in mind that if your soap is still somewhat soft, you might leave some fingerprints or some marks on your soap while you're doing this. If your soap has hardened enough, you won't have that With every batch that I make, I reserve a few bars to be cut into halves, and I sell these as well, just as little mini bars. And that is why you might have noticed that on some bars I placed 1 clove and on others I had 2. The ones with 2 are destined to be chopped in half. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, seeing how I make my turmeric orange clove soap. Let me know if you had any questions. I'm happy to answer in the comments. And have a lovely day.